Now with all the previous information, now let's look at the movements of the shoulder joint. We have abduction, we say moving away from the body. Upward lateral movement of the humerus to the side and away from the body. And we have adduction, which is the arm moving toward the midline. Next, we have flexion, which we're going to decrease the angle of the joint this way, upward. Moving the humerus straight anteriorly, so we're moving anteriorly. That's through the sagittal plane. So extension, we're moving it toward, through the sagittal plane, downward, and then posteriorly. So we have flexion, extension, and this is actually, when we go behind the midline, it's actually what they call hyperextension in some books. Horizontal adduction. So horizontal meaning transverse plane, raise the arm up. As we move toward here, horizontal adduction, we're adding to the midline. Or it's also transverse flexion, because in flexion we're decreasing the angle and in the transverse plane, so we're going to do this toward the midline. Then we have horizontal abduction, so in the horizontal plane, transverse, moving the arm away from the body, away from the midline. So if you look at rowing actions, that's in abduction. Chest presses or flies would be adduction, or horizontal flexion, or transverse flexion, transverse extension, horizontal adduction, horizontal abduction. External rotation, if we're in the standard anatomical position, specifically, this is the fundamental position. We raise our arms up, we flex at the elbows, we externally rotate the arms. This is through the transverse plane, through a horizontal axis, or vertical axis, excuse me. Vertical axis, moving through the transverse plane, externally rotating, internally rotating. We can also do this action by raising the arm up, abducting, flexing, externally rotating through the sagittal plane, and then we're going to internally rotate in the sagittal plane. But it's still considered external and internal rotation. We just have to look at the orientation of the joint and the segment that's attached to that joint. Diagonal adduction, movement of the humerus in a diagonal plane away from the midline of the body. So we start here, diagonal, that's abduction, diagonal adduction, away toward the midline. Now let's look at the intrinsic glenohumeral muscles. They originate on the scapula and on the clavicle. This would be the deltoid muscle. Remember, there's three parts of the deltoid: the anterior, medial, and posterior. The coracobrachialis, which is attached to the coracoid process, and the teres major, which is attached to the lateral border of the scapula and attaches on the arm. We also have to look at the rotator cuff group. The subscapularis is attached on the clavicle, or not the clavicle, the scapula and the clavicle, depending on which muscle. Subscapularis, supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres minor. The intrinsic glenohumeral muscles are the latissimus dorsi, because it attaches on the vertebral column, wraps around. It's attached to the vertebral column and the pelvis, wraps around, attaches to the rib cage, and attaches to the intertrabecular sulcus on the arm. So the pec major attaches to the sternum, attaches to the clavicle, and inserts right above or anteriorly to the latissimus dorsi muscle and the teres major. Now anteriorly, we have the pec muscle. We also have the coracobrachialis, the coracoid process attaching to the arm. The subscapularis, if you remember, it's on the front side of the scapula and attaches to the upper part of the humerus. That's anteriorly. Superiorly, above, we would have the deltoid muscle, above. Then we have the supraspinatus, which is above too. That's the top rotator cuff muscle as well. That attaches to the top. Superior again would be the deltoid. That's above. Supraspinatus. Posteriorly, we have a latissimus dorsi, which is on the back. Teres major. The infraspinatus, which was on the back side. And the teres minor as well. This is just another pictorial view of where these muscles are located at. So you should have a good idea, be able to point out where these muscles are. Especially if you're trying to teach somebody some movement, you have to know where the muscle is, where the fibers are oriented, origin of insertion, and depending on at the shoulder joint, because remember, it's multi-axial, it goes in different angles all the way through different planes of motion. So you have to know what part of the muscle, what muscle is working, what part of the muscle is working, depending on the movement that you are requiring that person to do. If you look at the nerves, all shoulder joint muscles are innervated from the brachial plexus. Remember we talked about the peripheral nervous system, and they're bundles of nerves, and this particular, the plexus is a bundle of nerves. This is the brachial plexus, which means on the arm. The lateral pectoral nerve assisting rises from C5, C6, and C7. This would be the pectoralis major on the clavicular head, because remember, it's attached up here. The medial pectoral nerve arises from C8 and T1. That's the pectoralis major from the sternal head, because remember, we have upper and lower pecs. So if you're doing incline presses, that's working the clavicular head. If we're doing flat bench or declines or push-ups, then we're working the sternal head. So we have clavicular, the upper part, sternal is the lower part. And the thoracodorsal nerve arises from C6, C7, and C8, and that would be thoracodorsal, dorsal on the backside, thoracic, meaning the middle part of the vertebral column. That's the latissimus dorsi. Now the axillary nerve branching from C5 and C6, that would be the deltoid. The teres minor, which is a rotator cuff. And sensation to the lateral patch of skin over the deltoid region of the arm. So that would be right here, those dermatomes. The upper subscapular nerves arising from C5 and C6, and that's the subscapularis, which was in the internal rotator of the arm. And when the arms are down, it internally rotates. The lower subscapular nerve arises from C5 and C6. Once again, the subscapularis, one of the rotator cuff muscles. Also is the teres major, which pulls the arm down. It abducts and extends the arm. And the suprascapular nerve originating from C5 and C6, which means the supraspinatus, supra meaning above or up, and also the infraspinatus as well. Both are rotator cuff muscles. The musculotaneous nerve branching from C5, C6, and C7. This controls coracobrachialis, which is a flexor of the arm. The sensation to the radial aspect of the forearm, the radial aspect, the outside for the basic anatomical position without doing pronation. So the radius will be on the outside, and that's where you would feel that. Now let's look at the deltoid muscles. The anterior fibers, they cause abduction, first of all, before we do this, I want you to look at the fiber arrangements. Broad base here, attachments. Smaller insertion point. And look at the way the fibers are arranged in a diagonal. It's a triangular shaped muscle. So the fibers are all at different angles depending on which section of these are. So here we have the anterior, we have the medial, and we have the posterior. And you need to keep that in mind when you're looking at it, depending on what action you want to do, whether it's a bench press, a flexion movement, an overhead press. We have to see where the orientation of any of these heads of that deltoid are. How are the fibers that were arranged? So let's look at the anterior fibers. When you're in this position, those anterior fibers can help in abduction. So do the medial fibers. But the fibers that are closest to the medial head will help in abduction. It's one of those auxiliary muscles that actually they're helping synergist muscles that help in that particular movement. Now, for flexion, it's basically all anterior delts. Now, if you keep your hands this way, or even in the standard position here, if you look at the orientation of the arm, if the elbows are pointing straight back, those anterior fibers to the front, they're all going to activate when you do that. Even if you have a dumbbell in your hand and you're in the neutral position of the hand, if the whole arm isn't internally rotated, then you're going to work those anterior fibers. So if you here got a dumbbell and you just do internal rotation at the elbow, you're fine. You can line those fibers up and do that. But you see a lot of people that grab those dumbbells, and when they grab the dumbbells, when they do flexion, they'll do this, and they'll end up and they'll turn they'll really pronate their hands. And so when they come on up, what are they doing? They're not just turning the hand this way, they're internally rotating the whole arm. So if you look at that, those anterior fibers aren't lined up directly against gravity. When they internally rotate the whole arm, they're taking away most of the fibers of the anterior delt. The outside fibers toward the midline are being utilized, but you're actually working a lot more medial delt, not anterior. When you rotate the whole arm, you're doing that. That's one of the things we see a lot in bodybuilding exercises when people are doing this. They're internally rotating the arm too much, and they're working a different head on that deltoid. They also help with internal rotation, those anterior fibers. The middle fibers, all abduction. That's what they do. When you're lined up properly, if you look at that, those medial fibers are running straight up and down. Gravity's going directly down, and you're directly opposing gravity. And you see a lot of people, when they do lateral raises and stuff, they're leaning backwards and stuff. So when they externally rotate, they're pulling the medial fibers back toward that way and involving more anterior fibers to pull up. You've got to be in the right position to line those medial fibers up directly against gravity. For the posterior fibers, it helps in abduction. Here are the fibers of the posterior side. The ones toward the middle or toward the medial will help in abduction. They also, if it's lined up correctly, if the posterior fibers are directly lined up right, they're going to pull back this way. When they shorten, they'll pull the arm into that sagittal plane, do extension. They also cause horizontal abduction. So if we're up here this way, horizontal abduction. They also help with external rotation too, depending on the orientation of these fibers and where they're at. The pec, once again, we have an upper and a lower portion. This is the clavicular head. That helps in internal rotation. Once again, let's look at this. Here's the broad base of attachment on the sternum. We have the upper fibers that are attached to the clavicle. The first two-thirds of the clavicle have the upper fibers. And when they come down, look how they're angled down. And look how the fibers all will change their angle of insertion depending how this muscle is laid out when they're in this position. And also too, I want you to also notice too that it's a flat aponeurosis, a flat tendon, but the upper fibers are actually on the bottom with the lower fibers underneath and above them. This is for when we're doing incline presses. You want that angle of pull is directly against gravity, so they're going to pull it up this way depending on what the angle of your bench is. So, and the more the bench is flat, you're going to, as you come down, as you come this way, more toward transverse flexion this way, you're going to work more medial fibers or the lower portion of the pecs. So as you see, if you see people doing benches with their arms straight up and parallel with the ground, this way, if they're laying down, if that elbow is even with the shoulder joint, that means they're working all upper pecs, not lower. They're not working very much. If you look at the angle where the bar is sitting at, about where the base of the sternum is, it's about the angle of the arms between 60 and 80 degrees, depending on which book you read, or looking at, you can actually measure it. But the bars down here, and doing a flat bench, you'll see more of the sternal pecs. The elbows are up here, or you're at an angle, you're going to work upper pecs. Now, if you look at doing a decline bench, the arm is actually internally rotated, and we're actually pressing this way, and we're pulling on those lower fibers. That's why they do decline. That's why they do all different angles of that to develop the chest for full development of that chest. But it depends. Once again, if the arm is up this way and internally rotated, you're going to directly stretch those lower fibers and pull with those fibers. The more externally rotated you are and your arms are coming up this way and out in front of you like this, you're going to work all these. Remember the vector analysis. We got a vector here, force there, force there. The vector resolution would be right toward the middle. But as we move our arm up more with the elbow toward the shoulder, even with that, it's gonna, these fibers are gonna pull this way and pull directly toward there, so you're gonna work that. So we need to be associated with how those fibers are arranged, muscle fiber architecture, and the shape of the muscle. It will all dictate force production, and the line of pull will change drastically depending on the shape of the muscle. Once again, talked about the lower fibers. We also call it, they help with internal rotation, horizontal adduction. They help with extension as well too. When you're actually coming back, when you're coming this way, those fibers will help pull, and when they contract, they'll help pull the arm this way. Also helps with adduction as well too. As you bring arm up here, if you look at the lower fibers, the way they're inserted at, they'll pull down. As they shorten, they'll pull down. But I want you to notice shape of the muscle, angle of the fibers, muscle fiber orientation, how this insertion point is. The upper part is actually on the bottom, and the lower part of the pec is underneath. And depending on, as the internal external rotation of the arm changes, as well as where the orientation of the elbow is, depending on how you're pushing, will dictate what part of that chest you're actually working. The latissimus dorsi, once again, we have to look at where it's attached at, where it's originating at, and look at the fibers. Once again, it's a triangular shaped muscle. These fibers here, when the arm is up here, the outside fibers, as it's pulling down, they'll work. And once again, as they keep pulling, as these shorten, then the rest of them will fire accordingly. It goes from here to pull the arm down through its full range of motion. It helps in adduction. It also helps, depending on the orientation, when you're doing adduction, arm up, external rotation, pulling down. The outside fibers will work first, and as they shorten all the way, then the upper fibers here, the more upward fibers will contract to pull the arm all the way down. Also too, when you're in this position and this way, in the sagittal plane, they will work the same way. It helps cause extension as well. The arms pull this way. Pull down in the frontal plane, and pulling, extending the arms in the sagittal plane. They also help with internal rotation. Yes, depending, because it's attached to the front of the arm, not behind. It's attached just below the pectoralis major muscle on the arm. And when you're in this position too, when all these fibers contract, if it's attached to the front arms, it helps assist in doing internal rotation. And it also helps in horizontal abduction. So when the arms are this way, when the lats fire, they're another assisting muscle to cause horizontal abduction or transverse extension. Teres major attaches on the shoulder blade and attaches just underneath, or right about the same point where the Latissimus dorsi attaches as well. It causes extension, particularly from a flexed position to the posterior extended position, from anterior to posterior. Flexed position. Flexed position pulls down this way. Also helps with internal rotation. Helps in adduction when you're this way. Helps pull down. Helps pull down, particularly from the abducted position down to the side and toward the midline of the body. It really helps in that frontal plane action. The coracobrachialis, it's attached to the coracoid process, and it helps in flexion of the arm. See, it's attached to the middle of the arm. It helps in adduction, pulling the arm down this way to the side. Adduction, adding to the midline. It also helps in horizontal adduction. So for in this position, helps pull it in this way. Once again, you got to look at where it originates, where it attaches at, or inserts at, and how it's working as it pulls on the arm, and depending on what position and what plane of motion you're doing too. Rotator cuff muscles. We have what they call sits. We have supraspinatus. It's attached to the greater tubercle. Remember the greater tubercle, right up here, attaches to that. From the above, it abducts the arm. It pulls it up this way. Pulls it up this way because it's attached to the top. It originates in the top part of the shoulder blade, just above the spine, and then it attaches to the greater tubercle of the arm, and it starts abduction. We have the infraspinatus. It attaches the greater tubercle posteriorly. It's attached back in through here and attaches to the back side, to the greater tubercle posteriorly. Here's the greater tubercle. The supraspinatus is up here. The infraspinatus is back here. Teres minor attaches to the greater tubercle posteriorly, just below that, the teres minor, or the infraspinatus, and it causes external rotation. So does the infraspinatus, external rotation. And then we have the subscapularis, attached to the front side, and it will attach to the lesser tubercle, which is on the anterior side, and that causes internal rotation. So SITS, S-I-T-S, that's the rotator cuff arrangement. Now these muscles, as I said, they're the only true stabilizers of the shoulder joint. They're not very large muscles. Now, you have to train them accordingly, because since they're not very large, they must possess great strength and muscular endurance, because when that arm, the shoulder joint's rotating all the time and moving through multiple planes of motion and multiple actions, so they need to be able to have not only great strength to be able to cause this action, but they have, if you're doing simultaneous movements all the time, they have to have great strength endurance and endurance strength. Conducting repetitions overhead, throwing, swimming, pitching, even in overhead pressing and all that. If you have poor technique, if you have muscle fatigue or inadequate warm-up conditioning, this leads to failure of these rotator cuff muscles, because if you're in the wrong position and the external larger muscles can't take over that so these can stabilize, all the stress will go here. And that's what causes a substantial amount of injuries in these smaller stabilizing, internally, externally rotating muscles, depending on what plane of motion you're in and where the orientation of the arm is. Leads to further rotator cuff problems, such as tendinitis, rotator cuff impingement, means squeezed together within the subacromial space. And the subscapularis, once again, on the front side. If we're looking at here, it's on this side. It attaches to the lesser tubercle and causes the internal rotation. It also helps in adduction as well too, because once again, when you pull the arm up, it'll lengthen these fibers, and then when you go back down, they'll contract and help pull the arm down. And adduction as a synergistic muscle. It also helps with extension as well. If you come up here, it'll help in extension. Stabilization of the humeral head and the glenoid fossa. Once again, it's a stabilizer muscle and internal external rotator. The supraspinatus, it does abduction. Once again, it starts the abduction movement away from the body. Once again, also another stabilizer of the humeral head and the glenoid fossa. The infraspinatus causes external rotation. It's on the back side. The back side of the scapula. Causes horizontal abduction. Horizontal abduction. External rotation helps in horizontal abduction and external rotation. It also helps in extension. If you look at where it's at, it's on the back side, the lower part of the tubercle, the great tubercle, so it helps in extension. Once again, another stabilizer. Teres minor, external rotation, horizontal abduction. Again, when you're in this position, horizontal abduction or transverse extension, excuse me, helps in extension this way and extension. Once again, those are the four main stabilizers of the humeral head. Now, for glenohumeral flexion, the agonists are, once again, the deltoid muscles, the anterior delt. We talked about how the fibers are arranged. If we look at that from the fundamental position, the fibers originate here and attach down here. So if you look at it, the fibers, if you're pushing this way, there's where the force is. It's going to directly oppose that force. So that's going to cause flexion of the arm. If your arm is rotated, the fibers are going to be pointing away from that, so the medial delt will be working more. But you have to line up the fibers correctly to make sure they're all being worked maximally or most effectively. We also get the upper pec majors that cause flexion. Now if we look at that, let's go back again. Let's look at that. The upper fibers, look at their orientation. You got the front deltoid here causing this, but these fibers, even at that angle, the upper fibers will help in that. That's why you see a lot of people do bodybuilding exercise in the gym with the cables and they're pulling this way. They're working the upper fibers. They're pulling that way. So it's working the upper fibers. Now the extension, glenohumeral extension, teres major, they're extending the arm. Latissimus dorsi is extending as well. And the lower pecs are going to help too, because when you come back this way, if you look at where the pecs are located at, when they shorten, they're being stretched out a little bit when you come all the way up in flexion, especially against resistance. But when you have resistance this way, they're going to help pull the arm down and back. That's extension. Glenohumeral abduction, the deltoid, once again, the medial deltoid. That's what it's supposed to do, abduction. The supraspinatus, once again, starts abduction. The upper pecs are going to help in abduction as well, because look at the fiber arrangement. Look how they're pulling. They shorten, the insertion pulls toward the origin, and it's going to help raise the arm. Once again, an assistant muscle. assisting muscle. Abduction, like a lat pull down with weights, the agonists are Latissimus dorsi. Once again, you're doing a lat pull down this way. Even if you're doing a pull up, you're going to get depression of the shoulder blade, even when you're doing a pull down. First thing you're going to do is depress the shoulder blade, stabilize that shoulder girdle, so as the lat pulls, it's going to pull down on the arm, going to activate the lats this way. Once again, the arm is up here, these lats are being stressed, so when you're pulling down into that, initially it's going to be a stabilizing muscle and an abductor, or adductor, this way. So when you pull down, it's going to pull these fibers, and it gets more and more. It's going to recruit more of those fibers as it comes down through here until the arm comes all the way down, and then all the fibers will have been activated. Teres major does the same thing. And the lower pecs will be working there too, because as you go up this way, as you're pulling down, those lower fibers are going to be lengthened, and it's going to help assist in adducting the arm. Internal rotation, the agonists are Latissimus dorsi, Teres major, the subscapularis, and the pec major. They all attach anteriorly and medially onto the front and toward the middle part of the arm on the humerus. For external rotation, the agonists are the infraspinatus, as we discussed, the teres minor. Both are attached posteriorly on the graded tubercle, posteriorly toward the backside. Horizontal abduction, the agonists are posterior deltoid. So if we're flexed, internally rotated, away from the body, abduction, or transverse extension, it's going to work the posterior delt, because if you look at that way, and we turn the arm and externally rotate it, those posterior deltoid fibers, if we're trying to push out that way against the resistance, those fibers are going to be directly opposing the resistance. Everything's lined up accordingly, so it's going to work those posterior fibers. Now, the outside fibers of the medial deltoid will assist in this too. So will the infraspinatus. Teres minor does the same thing, because if you look at it, as you come up this way and abduct, it's going to lengthen them. As you come this way, it's going to lengthen them too. So when they come in horizontal abduction, they're all going to shorten. Horizontal abduction, the anterior delt works quite nicely. So does the pec major, depending on the orientation of the arm as well too. If you're up here, it's going to work more of the clavicular. If you come down here a little bit more, it's going to get a lot of the pecs too. And also depending on if you're more internally or externally rotated. The coracobrachialis is going to come up there too, because if you're abducted, look at those fibers. They're going to be lined up this way, so when they shorten, they're going to pull the arm this way. Diagonal abduction, agonist, posterior deltoid. Diagonal abduction this way, because you're going to rotate the arm in and come up this way. The infraspinatus is going to work, teres minor, and the long head of the tricep, because most people don't realize that the long head of the tricep will help extend the arm, or when it's in this way, it crosses that shoulder joint, so when it shortens, it's going to assist in extending the arm. In this case, it's abducting away, but it's also almost extending the arm. For adduction, both high and low, you get the anterior delt, coracobrachialis, bicep brachii, the short head. That's the one on the inside that's attached to the coracobrachial, the coracoid process. And the pec major, both upper and lower. A general adduction of the arm, this way and this way. Now, once again, as we talked about it in the last section, look at these websites, because they talk about injuries of that particular area, you know, how you can avoid them, how you can train for them, all that, different types of exercises, and different viewpoints of these particular joints, the muscles used, and all that. We'll see you next time.